years of development before all of the COVID-19 vaccine had taken place was, like, as you pointed out, like, essential for all of that to happen. How much of that is, how do you sort of prioritize which research to do in that case? Because once you've got that technology down, you can very rapidly transfer it to lots of different things. So that starting place of the 20 years, what was it like over those first 20 years?
Well, I think there's two aspects to think about. One is the vaccine platform. So here we're using viral vectors, Pfizer and Moderna used an RNA platform. And so the technical platform development is really important because that's in pandemics what's going to be the backbone of whatever you do. And the fact that we've got those two technologies, viral vectors and RNA, they're the only ones you can do relatively rapidly in development at the moment. And we were talking over lunch, the great advantage of RNA is you can go from, if you know what you're going to manufacture, you can be at millions of doses in 6 weeks. With viral vectors, 3 months to being at thousands of doses and much longer to get to millions of doses. So RNA is just incredible for that. Most of the other technologies don't allow you to scale that quickly. And so the platform technologies are important to continue to invest in. The second issue is the individual microbes, the viruses and the bacteria. And from a scientific perspective, for most of them, we actually know what you need to do. Like we do with coronavirus, if you spend 20 years working on it, you know that one particular protein on the surface of the virus, in this case spike protein, is the key one to put into a vaccine to then immunize the immune system, train the immune system to be able to defend against the virus when you meet it. So we know that for coronaviruses. That hasn't been done for most other threats that are out there. And so that's the research that's needed. So I don't think there's not really a major scientific obstacle on most viruses. It's just the investment needs to be there to do that work. The Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, the big funder of pandemic preparedness, only funds about 5 different viruses at the moment, but they have 100 on their list. And so I sort of feel science has got it, but we haven't done the science yet. We know how to solve this problem.
I mean, to bounce back off that then, though the bottlenecks in vaccine research or vaccine rollout or expanded access to vaccines around the world, they lie much more on getting access to it and like the economic side of it and the pull incentives.
Yes, I think in many different ways money is the issue, and it's the investment in the science to actually have the knowledge there in the first place. It's governments being ready then to put the money there to do the development when the pandemic does start. So, I mean, my point about the Americans, they already had set up that they would give $1 billion to each developer. There was no system in the UK for how they were going to do that initially. And the vaccine task force had to be set up and work out the process. But it wasn't an understanding that you just need to put the money out there so that no one hesitates. And in all of this, you have to think that where would you actually want to go for your pandemic vaccine? I would want to go to big pharma who know how to make vaccines. I wouldn't want to go to Oxford University, to be honest. You'd want to go to big pharma. But if you look at the big pharmaceutical companies, the only one of them that made a vaccine is Pfizer. GSK, Sanofi, all of the ones who make vaccines that we give to all of our children did nothing. And when you probe that, I mean, they did a little bit of tinkering, it didn't work. It's not really a scientific challenge, as I've just pointed out, but it's a risk. And the risk for big pharma is that they divert all of their energies to making a vaccine, that they have a short-term cash success, but then no one wants it anymore. And so the financial risk really inhibits pharma from getting involved in that space. But they're the people we really need. So I think money is all in all different parts of this is where the problem is.
Money is always the problem. To expand it also beyond pandemics, are there, because you've done a lot of work on streptococcus, like pneumonia vaccines in young children and in older adults, which have also saved many, many lives. One, could you tell us more about that as well, about vaccine research outside of the pandemic? And two, to then follow on from like misaligned financial incentives, there seems to be a bunch of infectious diseases where there is the technology for vaccines that exist, but we haven't rolled it out because the rolling it out to everyone doesn't line up on some sort of value of health economics.
Yeah, so I spent most of my career focused on vaccines for young children, and particularly the bacterial infections that have the highest burden of mortality. And so that's why pneumococcus, or the pneumonia bug, has been one of the things I've done quite a lot of work on. That is an organism which affects people all over the world, whether you're in a high or low-income countries. It's not really had a problem financially of its development, and big pharma is in that space these days. But other areas, I've done a lot of work on typhoid, which is an infection that children get from drinking contaminated water, and makes them very vulnerable to many hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions of cases every year. And that is a vaccine technology that's been around since the 1980s, but it wasn't developed until we only started rolling it out in 2022, because essentially there was no commercial financial incentive to actually produce a vaccine for poor people. And so we had to get to a point where we generated, from an international perspective, the demand, so that a company in India, Serum Institute of India, and Bharat Biotech and Biological, so there's Indian companies which can produce at massive scale, we're able then to see there's a demand. So even though we make a small margin, it's worth still selling it. Whereas GSK or Sanofi Pasteur would not make those vaccines because they would never be financially viable. So I think it's a really inhibits development because there is the financial incentive in the commercial world. I think the other area is where there are disease outbreaks that are very constrained. So viruses in Africa, Rift Valley fever, for example, where it's very small geographic area. So again, there's no money to be made, and so it's very difficult to get someone to take these vaccines on. It has a huge impact on those populations.
What changed in 2022 that meant the demand for the...
No, I think it was that we had been working for nearly a decade to, first of all, to support development, but then also to show the evidence about the burden. We ran a study in Africa and Asia involving, in 3 countries, 100,000 people in each country, so 300,000 in total, demonstrating the burden of the disease, that then starts to make the case to governments for saying we should be preventing this because it's a big problem in our population. One of the other big issues in low-income settings is the lack of infrastructure to be able to measure the burden of disease. And so if you go to a health ministry, you have physicians in there who say, yes, we see this all the time, we'd like to have that vaccine. But they can't persuade the finance ministry who've got to spend the money on health and education and defence and other things. They don't say without evidence that they want to spend it on disease. And if you've got no microbiology, then you've got the...
Wow, so the thing that changed then was actually having the infrastructure to be able to measure the burden of disease, to make an argument for there should be this demand for this vaccine.
There's a big bit of advocacy, some of which is evidence-based, which is generating the evidence of the problem. You've got to have the technology available to do something about it. And then there's another bit of advocacy, which is with the World Health Organization and with international partners.
Very interesting. I'm going to turn to some audience questions, because we've got a lot of audience questions. They are ranked by a number of votes, so I'll do them in like order. So if you like a question, let me know by liking other people's questions.
Don't like the answers.
Yes. The first question is, do you feel more confident after COVID that we're now better prepared for future pandemics?
I think there will be a period of time where there is some knowledge in some sectors of the ecosystem needed to respond to a pandemic, which will be helpful. But I'm not confident that will be retained over decades. Already, most of that knowledge doesn't exist in government.
Because of the turnover of...
Yeah. So yes, I think there's definitely at this moment a better understanding. We still have Christmas acute vacancies for a pandemic. There's plenty of people in universities and in industry. But I don't have confidence that that will be retained if you ask me that
Other very popular question is, do you know why AstraZeneca made the decision to make it not-for-profit?
Yes, so I think there's a commercial part of it, which is, because of course they had to tell their investors they were doing this, we're not totally pleased with the idea of doing something not-for-profit. So there's a commercial answer, which is, if you're a big pharmaceutical company, you're not making any profit in the pandemic. So if you intervene in the pandemic and stop the problem, you can then continue your development. And I think it is interesting, and I'm sure not linked to their involvement with the vaccine, but AstraZeneca has been the fastest growing pharmaceutical company in the last 12 months. So whether that's anything related to the way they're performing, I don't know. So I think I'm completely lost my train of thought.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That
oh no, there is a second bit, which is so Pascal Soriot, who's the CEO of AstraZeneca, he asked his kids whether he should do it, and not for profit, and they said they told him that you have to. This is the right thing to do. That was the other question. Is his kids.
There you go. You have parents. The most impactful thing to do is to get them to do things that are not for profit. What a great takeaway. There is. I'll combine two questions. There's one question on. If the next virus was deliberately man-made, if there was a next pandemic and there was a malicious actor trying to make a deliberately more pathogenic or more dangerous strain, would it be more dangerous or more hard to respond to?
Well, I mean, it's a difficult question because it depends exactly how they have manipulated it. I mean, I can put it a different way, that nature has already developed strains of viruses which we cannot respond to so far with vaccine. For example, HIV, emerging in the early 1980s. We've been working on how you could make a vaccine for this virus over that period of time, 40 years or so. And I don't think we're really much closer to having an HIV vaccine. And the reason is, it's a virus that mutates so rapidly that by the time you've made the vaccine, you're actually dealing with an almost completely different virus because it changes so much, even during infection of one individual. So I think the answer is it would be perfectly possible to think about ways of making these highly mutable viruses that could then transmit readily and not be one to which you take a vaccine against. So yeah, I mean, but certainly looking for progress in synthetic biology, I would be very concerned that that could be a direction of people.
Absolutely. Go on, George.
Sorry, in development on that point, you mentioned earlier interesting stuff about spike protein and antigens, and that more work should be done to isolate such antigens. But in the case of malevolent actors, I've heard some research suggesting actually that's going to play into the hands of malevolent actors. And if zoonotic disease every 100 years generates maybe 3 pandemic-style influenzas and COVID-style pandemics, we can actually expect similar rates for malevolent actors, and we should also expect them to be able to have the means to develop things that are more potent than nature could ever develop, because nature's not necessarily trying to kill us, but a malevolent actor is. So I guess, is virus hunting the question? Definitely the best strategy.
Well, thanks for that very cheerful question. I think that if you look back at the last 150 years, we've had 6 influenza pandemics. One of those possibly was a coronavirus, but most people think they were influenza pandemics. And we've got the ongoing HIV pandemic, we've had smallpox, and two cholera pandemics, and a plague pandemic that finished in the 1960s. So in that period of time, there's been a lot of infectious threats. There will be more of them, and I think if we're going to understand anything about how you might respond, we need to look across viral families. So like we have with coronaviruses and influenza, we know what you need to do to make a vaccine for those. And it doesn't matter which member of the family it is, we've got a pretty good shot at it. But for many viral families, we've done none of that work. So I take your point that it might generate evidence that could be used against us. but I think nature is a pretty big threat at the moment, so I don't think I'd want to hold back on generating that evidence so that we're better prepared. I mean, it's interesting to me that when you think about that burden of pandemic experience that we've had as humanity over that period, if you take this country, we've actually had military conflict much less commonly, and fewer people have died than have from pandemics. And yet we invest over 50 billion every year in military preparedness, which arguably is the right thing to do. But we don't invest even $1 billion, I don't think, in pandemic preparedness. So we've got that wrong. The Americans, I think, is the only country that puts substantial funding into the risk of the microbial world, because they see it as a biosecurity issue, a defence issue, and whereas we don't, we see it, we try and forget about it once the latest event has passed. So you said maybe once in 50 or 100 years. There's good reasons to think why it may be much sooner than that. I think after my lifetime, it may well be in your lifetime. And the reason is that we have climate change. Almost certainly, if you look at the biggest pandemics we've had, were sparked by climate change, like plague in the 1340s. Secondly, we've got an increasingly frail, elderly population with health problems. We're at 8 billion people on the planet at the moment. The next 30 years, we'll get to 11 billion. Pretty good at transmitting things around the world with travel. And we're encroaching on animal habitats where a lot of these viruses and bacteria come from, because we've got more and more people. So I think the chances of another pandemic soon, not too soon, but soon, are quite high. Influenza's top of that risk register, I have to say, still.
I didn't mean to downplay zoonotic crossovers or spillovers, more so to upplay malevolent actors. So Kevin Esfeld, who developed the CRISPR gene drive, he's like a big proponent of virus hunting actually being a potentially scary strategy, because zoonotic crossovers will happen more, climate change will bring animals closer to humans and more crossover opportunities. But weighed against the fact that AI, you can now chat GPT yourself and order some DNA and start composing these things yourself, it starts to be quite scary. But I really appreciate it.
But I don't think that goes away. I mean, and it shouldn't stop us still, in my view, still doing the work to make sure that we understand how better to respond, because part of the response to even the malevolent actors is going to be to understand the biology better.
Thank you.
So, to that point about the UK not investing enough money in pandemic preparedness, we've had one question that's like, how do we maintain pandemic vaccine production capabilities? And so I'll frame that question as, if somehow the UK government suddenly gave like 2 billion to pandemic preparedness and put you in charge, which they definitely should do, and create a fantastic institute around that, how would you allocate that, like 2 billion? Would you allocate for more? How could we use that money to maintain that capabilities?
Well, I think the most important thing, if you're focusing on manufacturing, is that you've got to have manufacturing that is as a good use case today. And we don't have a pandemic today, so you've got to be doing stuff that's useful for the UK, for the economy and so on. And the reason that that's critical is that if you're right that it's 50 or 100 years from now, you don't want to leave your manufacturing facility quiescent for 50 years, because when the pandemic hits, no one will know what to do. So you've got to have it able to keep up with technology, and to do that, it has to be live. At the moment, for vaccines, the only vaccine manufacturing we have onshore is near Liverpool, which is for influenza vaccines for children. And a completely bonkers setup. They're manufactured in Liverpool, it's then sent to somewhere in the US, they're put into bottles, and then get sent back again to be given to children here. So we don't even have the full ecosystem to put it together. The other thing you need to do is to secure the supply chain. And manufacturing whatever you're producing has to have very high quality components that go into it and that meet the standards that go to humans. And we are very limited in supply chains. Just one example of that, for the type of vaccine we made for COVID in the pandemic, they're making things that the cells that you grow the virus in are in great big bags that all the manufacturing sites we use, or 24 around the world, needed. And the Trump administration blocked exports, and the only supplier for that was in the US. So that so when you say what will you spend the money on, you've got to have a facility, you've got to have something you're going to produce in peacetime that is needed for your economy or to export, that keeps the facility warm, and you need to sort out your supply chain so that has some resilience, not necessarily always supplied from the UK, but has resilience from different countries to deal with politics.
That full, entire sort of end-to-end supply chain management, that you're not dependent on the bag manufacturer in the US.
And I'm not sure I spent the whole $2 billion yet, but at least I started.
We were having a conversation over lunch about the anti-vaccine movement and the limitations that places on being able to roll out vaccines to as many people as possible, which would be great to touch on again. And the specific question that has come in is how as Christians, given that some of the people who are at the forefront of the anti-vax movements are also largely outspoken Christians, how can we respond to anti-vaxxers generally, and then two, on that specific, seeing Christians being at the forefront of that respond?
Yeah, I think the first part of the question is perhaps the easiest, not that it's easy, which is that the most important thing with vaccine confidence for the population is to have positive messages that are available and easy access to information. But a lot of that, for the individual, whether you're thinking about vaccination for yourself or for your child, most vaccines are given to children under 5, is to have access to the vaccine and to the expert who can talk to you about the vaccine and provide the reassurance. So it's access about information. A lot of what's called hesitancy is a completely rational view that you want to talk to someone and get advice about your health. And I don't know if any of you have been to see a doctor recently, but you really want the doctor to tell you about the why, and to have some feel, particularly if you're not from the health space. And I don't think it's unreasonable for people to consider that with vaccines that they want information, and not just to accept them without some questions, because those people intelligibly usually do. So it's access is the problem, and lots of people ramp up hesitancy, which is just about rational behaviour, with being anti-vaccine. The anti-vaccine bit, at least in most countries, is a tiny proportion, and let's hope it stays like that. And the difficulty is with the conspiracy theories part of it, that there's not much you can do about changing unshakable beliefs. By definition, they're very hard to change for those individuals. But for most people, this is not the issue, and so you can protect most children, most adults, by just having better access. But you also need health promotion, which are positive messages. And what we were talking at lunchtime is the worst thing to do is to focus on trying to challenge the negative messages all the time. Because the biggest impact of challenging negative messages is that you give weight to the negative messages. And so you tell more people about the negative message. So that risk, from a communications perspective, is huge. I think your second question is very challenging because, as you say, there is, particularly in the US, a lot of very negative views in various areas of conspiracy theory, which comes from Christians. It's not just about vaccines. And I think that, of course, it's easy just to blur the lines and say this is just a group of fundamentalist individuals. But the truth is, there's a whole range of different reasons why people hold what I would consider to be false views. Some of it will be that they're conspiracy theorists and have unshakable beliefs. Some of it will be people who are just in an environment where that's the information that they've been fed, and if they can have positive messages more available in that community, will have a different view. But I'm not sure that being Christian or not is actually a problem. It's just being humans, and we're all flawed in one way or another.
Absolutely. To the point about...
There was a question there.
Oh, go on ahead.
Forgive my naivety, because it's not like expertise or run studies in the medical sphere. So, without there being longitudinal studies about, let's say, the effects of having a vaccine over time, when they're novel vaccines, how do I reassure a patient in the future that something's not answer to this question.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's a great question. There's a couple of different aspects to answering that. The first is just if we look at the pandemic vaccines, which everyone says they're not safe, they were developed too quickly. If you look at the number of person years of follow-up with the pandemic vaccines, we have never had so much information. Because they were people vaccinated in the trials on such a huge scale, and then obviously very many billions of doses have been distributed since, so we've got a lot of understanding about their performance. To some extent, in routine vaccines, which are developed using normal regulation, in Europe you need an exposure of 3,000 people in clinical trials before licensure. And the reality is that with all drugs and vaccines, a lot of our safety data comes post-licensure. And a lot of what you hear as scandals of things being hidden are actually just that things emerge. And the truth is that you can't find rare events, rates of 1 in a million, in clinical trials. And so you have to have good systems in place for picking up rare events afterwards and identifying particular groups of the population where things might not be safe. So I think the reassurance has to be in the system that the testing is done rigorously following regulation that allows us to pick up all common side effects, and that there is a monitoring system which you're part of if you're in medicine, and to monitor rare side effects once rollout has happened so that the indications can be modified to cope with that. I mean, you did ask a slightly cheeky question, which is about 50 years later, and that's obviously a difficult one because the scientific answer is if you want to answer that question, you have to wait 50 years. But I think the reality is that what we know about vaccines, and that may be different from drugs, is that almost all side effects happen within about 4 to 6 weeks of the vaccine being given, because it's to do with the inflammatory response. You've got a fever and a sore arm, something is happening then, or it's the immediate part of the immune response, and does it kick off something that might have an effect over the next 6 weeks or so. So I think mostly we actually do know what the long-term and the short-term effects are, because you pick those up relatively soon. There aren't really things which happen that then 12 years later come back to bite you. We've got no evidence of that over any of the vaccines that have been developed. So I think I'm reassured from the data so far that isn't really an issue. But it's an impossible one to answer properly scientifically, which is that you need to observe for 50 years.
I'm slightly reluctant to answer this question given what people said about your response to conspiracy theorists, but it's the most upvoted question, so I feel like we should address it head on. Hopefully the answer's easy. But the question is what percentage probability would you assign to COVID-19 having come from the lab leak?
I don't think it did. And the reason for saying that is that one of my colleagues in Australia who used to be at Oxford, he was involved in with his team who actually were looking at viruses in Wuhan and other parts of China over some years beforehand. He had a team which went into the wet market, which was thought to be where the virus emerged from. So those who are not sure, a wet market is where both domestic and wild animals are sold live. And they went in and they swabbed all of the areas where the animals were, which were sick and thought to have started the transmission to humans, and also where there were some humans who got sick and died. And they were able to find the virus in those areas of the wet market. Even though the Chinese had moved all the animals out by then and tried to clean, they could find evidence of the virus where the cages were. So I think he's pretty convinced. There's also some stuff in the scientific literature saying that because COVID-19 has a fluid cleavage site, which is a particular part of the genome which you could engineer in, and so people said it must mean it came from a lab. But the truth is that there's plenty of viruses, coronaviruses out there in bats that have this particular sequence in the RNA. So I don't actually think that it's from the Wuhan laboratory. I think it's most likely it comes from the wet market. But to some extent, I think the issue here is whichever of those two it is, doesn't really matter in a sense, Just as we had foot and mouth disease virus leaked from pipes at COVID at the animal health place 20-something years ago. Identified these things happen. Biosecurity is something which we all need to think about. And if I was the Chinese, I would be really worried about checking on biosecurity, because even if it didn't come from there, you want to be absolutely sure that you've looked into it and done that. And so I think actually the problem is more the transparency that I feel concerned about. I do think they tried quite hard to investigate it, but we don't know exactly what they did.
Absolutely. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question, because we've had quite a few questions about, which is more about the experience of going through that very intense period of time. And I suppose the questions are kind of focused on the theme of what was it like, and especially also on a sort of trying to find people who are trying to be ambitious and want to make the world a better place and do lots of impactful things. How did you approach trying to solve a very, very urgent and intense problem with, I suppose, not burning out, and finding a good rhythm of work and rest in that period?
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, I thought you were going to ask me what were my emotions during that period. But obviously, as a scientist, I don't really have emotions. And my daughter says she knows that's true. But I think one of the things that I think is really important is to spend your time worrying about things you can fix and not the ones you can't. And I try very hard to maintain that, because you can crowd out a lot of your thinking space and your emotional space by dealing with things that you can't actually do anything about. And I think one of the problems for me during the pandemic was lots of aspects of that, where I didn't actually live by my own belief in how to manage. And just one example is we reached a point in July of 2020 when we had the first results of that phase 1 trial coming, and we were getting a huge number of media inquiries, and a lot of what was being said in the media was wrong, and I felt I was getting out of control, and I felt I needed to control it. So it was incredibly stressful. But then when it got to July and the results came out, we had 1,000 journalists per hour contacting us. And you might think that's unbelievable, but you think it's not just the BBC and CNN, but it's every village newspaper in every country in the world was contacting us. And at that point, I can't control the narrative because it's impossible. And so it was quite a relief that moment of doing. I think that the major answer really to your question is that it's a shared responsibility. Although I've been very fortunate to have lots of personal accolades as a result, because it's about a whole team of people. And whether it's the cleaner who was going around and making sure all the doorknobs didn't have coronavirus on them so that we didn't get our staff infected and had to close down the vaccine centre. All of those people working in the lab and runners with the blood samples, you need that whole team of people to be working with the same people to do that. And so I really feel that it's a support you get, particularly from the senior people around you, really is what gets you through the stressful times. So it's a shared responsibility.
Wonderful. To the person who asked the question, who are the unsung heroes of the pandemic? I hope that answers that question as well. We could definitely chat for hours. You said you could speak for hours, we could chat for hours about it, but we are 4 minutes over, so we should end and give Andrew a fantastic.